Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And tonight we're going to do a little bit of a presentation, really kind of talking about who we are a little bit, where we came from, what our process was like, and how we got to this book. Also, the clicker is broken, so I'm going to say slide occasionally. Slide. So a little bit about us. My name's Jenny. I am not actually from Seattle. I'm from St. Louis. Just for context, I think we're going to talk a little bit where we're from and how we got here. I'm from St. Louis. I went to school in Chicago, was there for about 8 years, worked for the city of Chicago a little bit, then moved to Seattle. In 2006, I was here for about 10 years. Went to the University of Washington for landscape architecture and worked in all kinds of I worked in nonprofits and also the design disciplines of landscape architecture and urban design. Worked for the city a little bit. Moved to New York for about a year and now currently in San Francisco doing design work. So one thing that and also lived a little brief time in Copenhagen, and one of the things that I really enjoy is getting to know the place that I'm in. And this book, for me, has been a dream project that whenever I started doing geography in Chicago, really wanted to kind of dive deep into a city and learn about it through data. So this has been something that's been on my bucket list and something that I'm super proud to be able to have done with these two ladies.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. My name's Tera Hatfield. I grew up in Bremerton, Washington, which some of you folks might know is just a quick 45-minute ferry ride from here. So I grew up getting on that ferry and trolling around Capitol Hill for all ages shows when I was a youngin'. I moved away when I was 18 to go to college on the East Coast, but came back for grad school. I have a background in graphic design for magazines, packaging, and then I went to landscape architecture school. Because I was very interested in interaction design, particularly in physical space, and really how that comes together in a meaningful way with our digital spaces and screens. So I have a background also in creative tech, and right now I'm working at a startup that's focused on prototyping design tools for augmented reality and ultimately empowering designers to work in that space and in 3D. I'm super excited to be talking to you guys because ultimately, Seattle was really the city that defined urban for me. And this book was a sincere pleasure to work on, particularly because I had no idea who Natalie was when we first started this project, but I was very good friends with Jenny. So I'm gonna let you take it on.
Yes. I'm Natalie Ross. So I am actually from the Midwest. I'm from Iowa. And there's a lot of other Midwesterners that make up Seattle. In fact, they could be the majority at this point. So I have a background in geography and fine arts and really got into the idea of creating place from geography. So have a former life in cartography, map making. I got to drive one of those Google vans for a while. So every place that I've lived, I've really kind of dove into a mapping project as a way to understand the city. I've done that in Chicago, in Minneapolis, in Prague, in Qingdao, China, and now in Seattle here. And so, like Jenny said, this has been an amazing way to really get to understand the city and feel like I'm a real resident and have some roots here. So it was a really amazing project and really fun to work with these two.
So a little bit kind of just the context of how this book came to be. About 2 years ago, Gary Luke from Sasquatch Books contacted me and said, I have this project that I would like to do, and I'm looking for someone to take this on. And I, at the time, was moving to New York, actually, but I was like, yes, please, me, because I want to be connected to Seattle and be able to stay in Seattle, and this is something that I have a deep passion for. And so I put together a little team, which was amazing, and we worked on it not as our full-time jobs, but basically any time we could for 2 years. We did, every 3 months we got together and rented a cabin in the woods and basically just sat there, with some champagne, and really kind of dove into what we wanted to do for this book as a whole, just as the actual physical piece of it, but also what does Seattle mean to us, and really diving deep into some of those questions, and also kind of where can we get data, and there was a million different things that we had to figure out in order to create this book. So we got together and we really drilled down into that every 3 months, and then came away with a lot of to-do lists that we'd go back and kind of dive into, and then made sure that we checked in with each other. So the book came to us, or the topic of this book came to us really as a blank slate, in terms of we needed to fill in the pieces in the geography of Seattle, and really through the lens of what we wanted to kind of look at, what we were interested in, what we thought Seattle was, what we thought others would think Seattle was, so that those interesting points, but also what data was free and available to us, and what could we potentially create. That was a bit of a yin and a yang there, because we had a list of probably 300 topics that we wanted to dive into, but we also were looking and searching for data that we could utilize. And the third piece of that is how it could be visualized. So those three components were really important for us to kind of look through. And Natalie's going to go into that a little bit.
We wanted to have a metaphor to really hang the data on, instead of having a book that just kind of hits you over the head with lots of points of data. And so we got together and really liked the idea of thinking of this as a portrait. And I'm going to read you a passage from the intro that kind of describes our thoughts about this. So, Seattle, our own little slice of heaven, is a mythical notion as much as it is a real city, storied with fact and fiction that all tie back to place. Meditating on both the geographical and the cosmographical seemed an appropriate way to navigate this project. Through maps, diagrams, visualizations, and illustrations, we examined Seattle and the surrounding Puget Sound region in the spirit of Mercator. The resulting collection of impressionistic and ephemeral explorations were undertaken as portraiture, and by no means is this portrait complete or definitive. The moment it's published, a map is outdated, and so our attempts to depict the real Seattle can only be a snapshot in time, a captured memory. To initiate our meditation, we retreated into a mid-century bungalow with a view of Elliott Bay and discussed what makes Seattle special, what drew us to it, and what pushed us away. It was gray skies, frontier psychology, strong women, and strong coffee. Together, we collaged a landscape of impressions that, when squinted at with lowered eyelashes, had the quality of Seattleness. So this portrait really does describe that metaphor, and this is one of Tera's creations, and kind of takes some topics throughout the book and kind of meshes them together in this sort of introduction of the book. And so we divided even further there into two categories, points and lines. And these are two kind of prototypical geographic symbols. And we were thinking, because this is a very ephemeral kind of book, that the points are really places and periods, and the lines are more connective. And so that's really how we thought about those two portions of the book. So Jenny kind of just described our process a little bit, but we really did have to narrow down to 50 topics from 300. And so being design professionals and really being rooted in the built environment, we like to have things physical. And so we did a lot of Post-it notes and printing things out and spreading across the floor. And so this really epitomizes our process of trying to figure out what topics best fit together, that created a bit of a narrative and also had a good kind of visual flow. And so the next step was really to make sure that the things that we wanted to explore were visual. And we did that by sketching out ideas of how those things might look and how the flows of information could go. And so this is just a few examples of some of the sketches we did to really initiate that process. And so at the very end, we still were printing out every single page and putting it up on the wall to make sure that that visual continuity of the book still felt really good, that we were getting a good cadence of really heavy data versus light data. And Tera's going to talk about that a little bit more.
So as Natalie was talking about, it was really important to us to have a cadence and a visual rhythm with varying degrees of depth of data for the books. We have folks that are coming and reading the book. The audience is incredibly diverse with different perspectives, different reading styles as well. So we really wanted the book to be able to breathe. And so ultimately to do that, we categorized the visuals within the book, the infographics, data visualizations, and stories into a couple of different categories. So we have data light. So ultimately we have three categories, right? So we have medium and heavy as well that we'll go through. This is prototypical of a data light graphic. Ultimately, you can grok it at a glance. Here we're basically comparing the heights of iconic mountains in the Cascade Range. And here we have data medium. So unlike the data light, which is kind of easy on the brain, can really quickly glance at. Here we're comparing a couple of different data sets. This is actually an exploded timeline as a soil profile. So it's going back from the glacial period all the way to current day, looking at Seattle strata. And here we have a really great example of a data-heavy graphic. This is a graphic that is potentially overwhelming at first, but you can dig in and you can actually keep coming back to it again and again and taking something different away each time. In addition to creating these categories of data and creating this visual rhythm, creating some guidelines, visual guidelines, was incredibly helpful and important to us. Here we have standard hierarchy for copy, but we also were looking at colors that really reflected the Pacific Northwest landscape. So now we're actually going to dig into some of the maps, which I think is what most of the folks are interested in here. So I'm going to let Natalie go first here.
So one of the big topics that we wanted to tackle was the changes that Seattle is seeing. It's kind of our current zeitgeist, is this big overhaul of the physical environment. And we're called Crane City for a reason. I don't think it's currently the case, but when we started the book in 2016, Seattle was the fastest growing city in America. And so we really wanted to do a map that showed how the physical skyline had changed. And so this is a map of current to 2016 buildings in downtown Seattle. And it's divided into 4 different eras of growth spurts. So the white is 1900 to 1940, red is 1941 to 1980, yeah. Blue is 1980 to 2010, and then yellow is the current era. And that kind of coincides with the different building booms in Seattle. And so it was really interesting to see kind of the patterns that happened in those different eras. I think in the 80s, you really saw a lot of financial centers being built after the recession of the 70s. And that's all those really tall towers in blue. You see the Columbia Tower. And our current boom is really different than what we'd seen in previous areas, kind of combining different realms into one with this mixed use that you see in the yellow. And we are seeing these global corporate campuses happening, like the Amazon campus and Denny Triangle. And so it just really shows that urban living has kind of taken on a new flavor in our current era. And then we subdivided that into one block to take a really deep dive into what the history of those buildings were. And so this is looking at the block in which we have our central library. And you can see, as going from left to right, that there's really only one building that remains on that block, the Rainier Club. And so there's some interesting stories there, one of which was that it started off as really a white male-only club and progressively got more inclusive until now it's actually a concert venue. So one other interesting tidbit, and one thing that we wanted to do in this book was to try to link different topics so that you can kind of find storylines that continue through the book. And so we dug a little bit deeper into the library itself. We tried to tell the story of that library and how it changed over time. And so this is a model of the original Carnegie Library that we actually created ourselves through just imagery that we found online. And it's pretty interesting. The Carnegie Library almost didn't happen. The original librarian in Seattle, Sarah Yesler, really wanted this library to happen, and so they tried to get Carnegie to come and put money in Seattle, and he thought that this was a hot air boom town not worth investing in. And so an employee at the library supposedly set fire to the mansion that it was housed in and got the sympathy of Carnegie, and so he actually ended up giving Seattle the money. And so that was really the origin of the library, and then in subsequent years it became the mid-century modern building that you see to the right, and then the current building that you all are familiar with. So this is indicative of some of the different maps that we've done, is to really try to tell stories that are a little bit hidden in Seattle's subterranean archives.
So kind of on a different note, we've looked at macro stuff, and then we looked at really micro stuff. And so this is one of the topics that we were really interested in exploring, the gum wall, which is a unique trait to Seattle. So we dove into kind of what could we do here, and at first, I remember when we first talked about this, we really wanted to connect up with a scientist and scrape a little off of the gum wall and see how many germs were actually in that piece. We didn't find the perfect scientist to help us out with that, but what we decided to do instead, is to take a photo of it and then figure out kind of the flavor profile of that photo, which was a very interesting process of creating our own data, really, is that we chewed a bunch of gum and then compared that to the gum colors that were on the wall and then dissected that into different flavors. So mint and spearmint are very popular. And then just the interesting facts of that the gum wall had to kind of be removed, or it had to be removed in 2015 because it started corroding the building, all the sugar content in the gum. And so what they found on average was 150 pieces of gum on average per brick. So it was a very dense, heavy thing that's growing in growing down in the alley on Pioneer Square by the market. And it's coming back, so we'll probably see another flavor profile in the future. Another topic that is near and dear to my heart is the alleys. That's something that I started studying in graduate school while I was here. And one of the things that I noticed back then is that there wasn't really any good maps about all the different alleys that we had. I worked at the city at the time and kind of tried to dive into all the maps that could be on alleys, and there was no comprehensive map. So a project that I started then was with a co-partner was to walk every single alley in downtown Seattle and then map those out with data points behind it. So this is a little bit about a continuation of that project where we looked at the alleys and then compared that to other public space in Seattle. So seeing that alleys actually are big, substantial public space that we have and we're able to utilize, which is super interesting, and there's a lot of things that we could do with that. The third map that briefly want to talk about is just our unique steep streets. This is a very data light kind of map. It was we looked at the elevations of the steep streets that we have in downtown, and that creates a very interesting kind of cadence of walking around the city with those streets. And we just wanted to make sure to highlight that as something that's very unique about the way that we live in this city.
I think what's unique about Seattle is that, it's not just defined by its urban boundaries, but really about the big nature that surrounds it. And this is actually the Chehalis River Basin, which is actually, I believe, boasts the largest surge plain and wetland in the state. I believe it's the second largest watershed, second only to the Columbia. And this is actually just a small piece of it rendered in LiDAR, so from ArcGIS. So what you're seeing here is the historical floodplain, and those little squirming lines of white are where the river usually runs, but when there's flooding, it goes all over the place. And what's interesting, particularly here, is that, the Chehalis River Basin extends from, Grays Harbor up to the Black River. And we have issues of climate change and also deforestation here. There's an incredible amount of development that's happening in this area. And we know that this area floods. We have that data. And yet, we are still continuing to build in this area. It's kind of interesting. Excellent. We're also gonna jump a little bit outside of Seattle. This is actually a map, an ode to Twin Peaks. I love David Lynch. He's actually a big fan of mapping and cartography. He created his own map of Twin Peaks before he even started the series. And this map actually is sort of a collision between film geography, the actual real filming locations of Snoqualmie, and the metaphysical locations that happen within the show. So like the Black Lodge, right? The White Lodge. And that's really these two locations sort of coming together. And then lastly, before we get to Q&A, we thought we'd be remiss without discussing this graphic, which is actually on the cover of Seattleness. This is actually a histogram of the Seattle sky. So this is what the color of the Seattle sky looks like over the course of 365 days. I'm a local. I love gray skies. I shy away from the sun. So I was really interested in sort of those nuances of gray that happen that I really treasure. And so ultimately, this was really hard to find data. So I looked down. Maybe I could scrape images from Twitter or Flickr, that have the hashtag Seattle or sky. But ultimately, there's a 360-degree high-resolution camera on top of the Space Needle. Lucky me. And ultimately, we cut out the Seattle buildings, just kept the sky, and took 10 samples per day. And measured those across the year. And so you can sort of see, in the middle of summer, you get those really strident stripes of blue, and then on the edges, you have those, varying degrees of gray. So that's wrapping it up, and then we're gonna do a Q&A with Sarah Ellwood, but first we wanted to thank our contributors. There were quite a few folks that tag teamed and collaborated with us in creating some of these maps, and we just wanted to recognize them. Also wanted to recognize you folks in Town Hall for having us, so thank you.
I bet a number of you in the audience are educators, and so you will know that one of the great joys of teaching is to see the things that happen after people leave your classroom. Jenny was a student of mine my very first year as a professor at DePaul University in Chicago. And how amazing is it that students I used to teach are making books that I now want to teach with. And you get to know all of the great things that happen and the terrific people that they then build with. So that's why I'm really happy to get to ask them some questions about their book. I'm going to ask a lot of big picture geographer type questions. The first one, why this book, Here and Now? What is it about this time, this place, that makes your book important?
Well, the first thing that I'm thinking of is that we learned a lot about the history of Seattle through this process. And I think that this is a great book for Seattleites to read because it reiterates that what we're going through now has happened before. We've been through these really big population booms. There was the gold rush boom, the Boeing boom, the Microsoft boom, and I think there are lessons to be learned, but also know that we've gotten through it and been better for it. And so it's not the end of the world. Sometimes it feels like it, the way that, the discussions about the changes in our city have been. So that really felt like a good reason to do the book right now.
I think, I believe his name was Gregory Scruggs from The Stranger, had a really nice description of, that, this was sort of the antidote to the woe of the vanishing Seattle. And as someone who grew up here and has seen this city change quite a bit, it felt like a good time to really root ourselves in place and really try and create connections for people to their physical location, but also their community of people.
I think for me it feels like that Seattle, this book, Seattleness, is a nice connecting piece. I think there are so many new people coming to this town, and having something that can connect them to the actual uniqueness of Seattle, and the different flavors of that, and that it is changing and growing, and it has different kinds of flavors all the time. There's people coming in, and you'll be able to connect with that pretty instantly, and also have just topics to share with each other. I think you get a little bit more rooted in a place when you kind of know some of the interesting pieces of that place, and having that happen a little quicker with a bunch of people that are new coming in is a nice way to create a new Seattle and embrace those folks inside of it.
And speaking of flavor, my softball question for you was going to be, did you chew all that gum? And so since you already answered that, you're getting the hard questions.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your chapter scheme, points and lines. For cartographers, for people who design infographics, points and lines are the building blocks. That's how we do what we do. But you're using them in a more conceptual way, I think, to try to tell us something about different kinds of place knowledge or how place identities get made. Talk to me.
Yeah, we used it in two ways. One, in that it did resonate to our geography brains and our kind of urban design, landscape architecture brains. In terms of it is language that you use a lot in those professions, but also that it's part of a portrait. So we wanted to kind of think of it as, okay, there's a portrait framework, and then you have the points that you create and the lines that connect them. And I mean, it is a little bit fuzzy. We definitely talked about this over and over and over about what could we do to create cohesion in this book. And so the points and the lines were part of that framework of portrait, and also it really delved into what data can do.
I think we also wanted the book to be non-hierarchical. So you could probably go through and say, well, it would make a lot more sense if you had these topics right next to each other because they lead into each other, they have similar information. But in some ways, we want it to be more of a discovery and a journey. And so that's like the library is connecting to the building. They're not next to each other, and you kind of have to go through and just discover that. So it's a little bit of a mess, and that's on purpose.
Well, I think it's also, it's kind of similar, maybe an analogy, and I don't think we were thinking of this, of also when you're in a new city and you're discovering, and inhabiting a place and sort of seeing how it changes you and you change it.
One of the things that we did, you saw that picture of the wall of all the us having all the pages up on the wall. We arranged that probably 500 times in different ways to figure out what the best kind of way to frame this would be.
And had some heated arguments where one of us had to walk away for a while.
I won't ask you in front of all these people who that was. If you'd taken a photograph of all 500 designs, I see another great infographic.
Yeah, we should have done that.
Right. So you had a cartography question. Now I'm going to ask you a cultural geography question. cultural geographers would say that the kind of place meanings that you are showing us through all these graphics are shaped by things like age, race, class, gender, and so on. Talk to us a little bit about how those dynamics play out in sort of the data that were available, the sort of possibilities for showing us about place knowledge.
I think the first thing that really resonated with us was that we are 3 female authors, and this is a town that has a really deep history of women leaders. And so a lot of the topics we focused on kind of what were the interesting stories about women that we could find. And that's really a thread throughout the book. We have a portrait of, amazing women. We have some stories about how women really protected different parts of Seattle. They were advocates for, libraries and literacy in the city. And so that was a storyline that we really focused on as one of the identities in Seattle.
I think, one of the things that we did start with was that big long list of topics that we wanted to look through. And what we found was that some of those topics, the data just wasn't there. And we would have to kind of scrape together data that would have taken us years probably to put together. So that really limited some of the choices that we could make for the maps, which says something. Also, I think one of the things that we kind of looked through is we tried to touch on a lot of different topics, and sometimes we hit the mark and sometimes we completely didn't. So those were things that we had many discussions over, and really a lot of it came down to data availability.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note also that we tried to weave stories throughout the topics. So if we weren't able to capture one particular topic, particularly because we didn't have the data, if we did have information, we certainly tried to note it and weave it throughout the book. I think one of those important stories, for me at least, and I know I've talked about this in a few of the events that we've done, basically the Japanese internment camps and entire populations moving that had land here and that had to move. And we talk about that a little bit with the Kapoto Garden.
Yeah, one other thing I guess I want to mention is that we are built environment professionals, and so a lot of the more physical things really resonate with us. And so the maps themselves might actually be about the physical environment, but have those stories kind of woven into them. So that was sort of the tack that we took in the book.
Yeah, I think one of the things we see is that data as such oftentimes mirror power. And so you've done some narrating around some of the silences in your data. That's one of the things I really like.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So futures thinking, sort of a question. I think oftentimes as authors, when we write, we're doing it because we want it to do something that matters in the world. It's like throwing a stone out there in a pond and wanting certain ripples to happen. So what do you hope this book does?
Yeah, I think for me, I want this book to bring people joy. I want this book to be something that sits on someone's table or sits in a classroom, and it brings people can go through it and be like, oh, I didn't know that, and it continuously brings people joy. And people can learn new things from it, and also start thinking about their own Seattleness and add to it. I feel like that's something that would be a major success for this book for me.
I really liked what our forward writer, Tim Wallace, said in his writing, is that we all get really stuck in our routines. We drive the same routes to work every day, and we can start being blind to the things in our city just because we're so familiar with them. And so doing things a little bit differently can help you to appreciate your city a little bit more. And the book really did that for us, to help us, explore more, take different routes. And I think if that was our pebble, to just get people to take a different route to work or just think about their city in a little bit of a different way, that's a really positive thing. Builds brain cells, makes you just more excited about the place that you live.
I love that answer. I'm going to say, yeah, go adventuring.
See, that wasn't such a hard question. And on the joy front, you're definitely doing it. Another former student of mine texted me at 5:30 this morning because he was so excited about his book. So it's working.
Very cool.
Welcome.
Hi, ladies. My name is Mitam Nguyung, and I'm an urban planner by trade. So when I saw your book at Ellwood Bay, I was like, oh my God, somebody did it. I'm so thankful. And I spent a lot of time in ArcGIS and all the Adobe software. So thank you for the thousands of hours that you committed to doing
Thank
this.
you for saying that.
Thank you.
Yes, I was like, I understand the pain and the many sleepless nights. So that being said, what I'm struggling with is, I grew up in a fishing village in Vietnam. I came here, I grew up in low-income housing in Seattle with a single mom. And I love the joy that you bring out with the book, but I also know the deep pain of this city. So first, how are you defining culture? And the second is, how did you navigate as three, to me, white-presenting women, all the cultural elements of this, all the deep pain of redlining, and also the massive inequality that we have in the city that's quite visible. So I love to hear, and I love the book, and I'm just like, oh man, I wish there were things about Chinatown. I wish there were things that address class and race, because we also have this deep pain, and place is complicated. So, yeah.
I think that you're totally right, that there are tons of topics about Seattle that we couldn't address and didn't address. And in some ways, we shied away from some things knowing that we couldn't necessarily do them justice. And I think that was one reason that we spent a lot of time in our intro talking about that this really is a small portion of representation of Seattle and something that the three of us could do. And I think it takes a lot of different people writing about their experience of the city to capture all those things. And so we tried to tell a few stories, but definitely missed a lot of them. And so we just want to acknowledge that for sure.
I think there's also other books, in particular, that were just recently published, that for our book, when we're telling a story in, maybe 2 pages or 4 pages, how to really do some of those topics justice. A lot of the topics even that we covered could, really be an entire book. And I think there was something that also that the writer of the Stranger article mentioned was that, yes, we touched on a few social justice issues, but there are a wide array that we completely missed. So I appreciate your question, and I want to validate it.
Seattleness Part 2.
I'm hoping for that. I'm looking forward to that one. So thank
There's
you.
so many interesting data sets being built that go to things like the landscape of places in Seattle that still have racially restrictive covenants in their language.
Yeah.
How interesting would it be to see that?
Yeah.
Appalling, but
So
meaningful.
look forward to more.
Thank you.
Visualization is a conceptual and exploration process. And so I'm curious where you were surprised the most after you dug into the data, where you were frustrated the most that you felt like you didn't really get to what the data was saying, and where the edges were in terms of the exploration.
There were a lot of things that we dove into and spent a lot of time researching that in the end were just sort of futile. So let me try to think of some examples.
I have one.
Go for it.
The salmon map. Yeah, so one of the topics, it was a lighter topic that we were interested in, was looking at salmon identity across Seattle.
Right.
And there's no data set on that. And we looked, And then we also had someone go out and start taking photos of every salmon that she could see in Seattle. And then that went nowhere.
Don't you mean Tera went, Natalie went everywhere?
Natalie went many places.
Well, I can't say everywhere, but I did a few hikes.
Yeah.
Salmon art hikes.
Salmon art
Yeah.
hikes. And we have a little bit of a data set, but at the end it was just too hard to get there, but we spent many hours on it. And there was quite a few maps like that, actually.
Well, here's another example. So we have 2 maps. One is UFO sightings in Washington State, and another is Sasquatch sightings. And so those are 2 very data-rich websites where there are personal accounts of the sightings, and there's no Excel spreadsheet, and a lot of the numbers are actually like written out in a narrative, and so we had to go through and painstakingly code that information into something that we could visualize, and so that was at the very beginning of the process that we were doing things like that and realizing very quickly that that was not gonna keep happening, you know, and so I think there are a lot of really rich stories out there to tell that aren't necessarily quantitative, and so we definitely ran into that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can't wait to get hold of your book. I really like that you described your book as a portrait, and maybe what you've done is described a city in a new artistic style. Instead of impressionism, it's whatever you would call your book. So now that there's a style, what might be the next city or 2?
We have gotten that question recently, and I think if you would have asked us maybe a year ago, we would have been, no, none. But I think at the end, we're all still friends, which that's a big success milestone out of this, so that's good. That's step 1. And we did really enjoy this process along the way. I think one of the things that we've all talked about is living here and for a time period, for a good chunk of time, was really helpful to be able to actually understand at least the city that we know in our lens. So we've lived in a lot of different places, and so possibly one of those cities could be something that we could tackle in the future, but that would be our restriction, is that we would have to live there for a bit of time.
I think it would be really fun to do my hometown of Cedar Rapids, mostly because, like I was saying, a lot of the cities that I've lived in, I've been able to explore through the lens of mapping, and now I'm thinking about Cedar Rapids, I'm like, gosh, I don't even know where a lot of stuff is. I've never even been down some of these roads, and so that would be a great reason just to do the book.
Here we come to Cedar Rapids.
Cedar Rapids, here we come.
Yeah, I think to Jenny's point, it's really important that you for me, that you have roots in a place before you start talking about it and espousing about it. I think it's really important to absorb and listen from the folks who have lived there and made a living for quite some time. I guess I think that's an interesting. I would probably do Bremerton. I've always wanted to do a photo essay of kind of a vanishing Seattle, but a vanishing Bremerton. It's very quickly becoming a bedroom community for Seattle, and it used to be, when I was growing up, very blue collar. It's a Navy town, and it also gets challenges from Silverdale for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to get into that. But
you've kind of touched on this, but I'm wondering, could each of you speak to if you could have kept one chapter or one topic in there, what would you have included and why?
I'm looking at my husband right now because he's one of the contributors and he did a lot of the research and some of the writing for us. And I'm thinking, do you remember, Andy? Actually, one I'm thinking of that was a little bit more of a kind of fuzzy topic was I really wanted to do a smell map of Seattle. And this is something that I've seen other people do in different places. And it's like a crowdsource kind of way to create the map where you have people go out and smell things and then somehow map it. And I thought that would be really fun, but we didn't do it.
I think Jenny and I kind of said ours. I know that the Salmon Art Map was really a passion for Jenny. She was really into it. She was like, it's so iconic, it's hilarious. You know, the art is, you know, generally, it spans a variety of spectrums. It's just very interesting that we have a focus on that here. And for me, again, it was really that movement of populations during the Japanese internment.
Yeah, one other one that we were crazy. We were thinking about this, but when we started, we wanted to do some map where we were going to have people go on a little treasure hunt, and then we were going to map their routes, and we were going to mail a bunch of people things and have them map their routes, and then we were going to collect all of that information, like a collective Seattle. I still think that would be really fun, but that would have eaten up. We wouldn't have this book right now.
Yeah, we were also really interested in a diagram of the Seattle freeze, quote unquote. And it ultimately we were like, you know, let's keep this upbeat.
Well, and then we tried to map it, and we're like, it's a feeling, not a map.
Yes.
Hi. I'm so excited about your book. And my friend Carol and I are here tonight. And I came partly because both of us got here in various ways from the East Coast, having studied art history and design, and wound up with backgrounds and careers in art and design. And but that was in the 70s. So we had this amazing outlook on the city from the 70s, the mid-70s, until now. And it's very easy to feel kind of negative about some of the things that are happening. And I love this upbeat attitude that you have about Seattle. And, you know, there's some very weird and interesting things about Seattle, and it's very eclectic, and it's got some wonderful sort of mysterious kinds of things that you only find when you're here for a while. But I think I'm just curious. There was a show that was done, and my Aunt Jean Falls was involved in writing this, and it was done twice. Unfortunately, it only went up until about the 80s. But it was about it was called Seattle Eclectic, and it was about all the weird and sort of quirky and strange things about Seattle. And I was just curious, I mean, you've got some of this in here, obviously, with the gum wall and some of the other things, but we've got the troll, and we've got other things that I know Vanishing Seattle talks a lot about. But I was just curious if that's something that you considered sort of dealing with. Just it's just such an unusual place, and it's changed in so many ways.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of the troll, we actually we walked by it yesterday, and we're like, I forgot that.
Shout out to Steve James. Yeah. It's my professor.
There's so much of that we definitely, now that we had a thing that we were trying to collect all this information in, we often go, we forgot that one, or we forgot that piece, or we forgot something that's really unique about Seattle, or it's a really hot topic that we didn't touch on as much. I mean, there's all of those pieces that this book just could live forever, and that's something that we don't need to be the ones in charge of that. It just needs to live forever.
Yeah,
just have to
those
keep
stories
updating
should be
it.
told.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Hi, I was suddenly reminded of a cultural map of Seattle and surrounding area that a very sarcastic and crude one that showed up on Reddit, and I was wondering if you spotted it, one. And the other was you skipped a couple of slides and said you were saving them for the Q&A, so I was just going to remind you of that and hope for some commentary.
So I can talk a little bit about this. Natalie and I collaborated on this, and I'm trying to remember where the idea came from, but ultimately I really wanted it to look like an actual pinball game, and this is actually modeled off of Medieval Madness, so I don't know if there's any pinball players in the crowd, but it's one of my favorite games. But ultimately it tells a variety of information. So we have the top 15 Seattle locations highlighted, and they're actually geographically, somewhat accurate in terms of like North Seattle and, SoDo. And then we also have the number of pinball machines in Seattle. I want to give the microphone to Natalie, though, because she wrote some lovely lines about pinballs.
I'm trying to remember here. Yeah, this was just a fun one. I think we included this because it was kind of like, okay, some of these were really handmade. There's nothing very particular about locations or, that we have timelines represented here that are not, the lines aren't accurate in between each one, So we tried to have fun with some of these maps, and just, it was a way to try to show information in a creative way and just tell the story in a format that you'd never seen before. So that's really what this map is about.
I was wondering, when it came to making them, was it like one person would do one, or was it kind of a collaborative effort for each one?
That's a good question. So we started off basically building out the whole book in sticky notes all together, every single topic, and then we each took a third as a lead of all the topics in terms of what to go find the data. Then we got together, figured out what data we could do, or what data that we had and what maps we could do. Then we each took a third again, and we went back and we did a drawing of which each of the maps might be. And then we came back, we all looked at that, we did a bunch of crits with each other. Sometimes we took some of those and we gave them to each other to actually work on. So for instance, if Tera had a skill that I wasn't so great at, I'd be like, Tera, this map needs this skill, please go run with it, and vice versa. And then so we kept doing that every 3 months. We'd get together and do this shuffle of maps. And to the point where we basically we all touched each one of them in a way. I mean, we definitely have the ones we were leads on, but really we all have our hands and hearts in each one of these maps.
Yeah, I think for us also, before anything touched the computer, the research, and then drawing, how this data could actually be visualized, and going through an iterative process there before we jumped in and started moving pixels around.
I think one of the things we did very beginning was we talked about what we wanted this process to look like for each other, especially because this wasn't our full-time job, so we needed to balance that out. So that's kind of how we structured it with each other. But also, we did not get into the computer until we knew we had Tera, who's amazing at graphic design. She put together some color palettes, some font types. We started with that structure before we went anywhere near the computer.
Shout out to our contributors, one of whom is sitting right there, Andy Donovan.
Yes.
They did a lot of work in this book, a lot of the research. They came up with some of the topics too, and did some of the modeling for us and helped us with some of the coding. And so this was definitely it takes a village, because we didn't necessarily know how to do all these things. So it was definitely a big collaborative effort, and our contributors really helped.
Yes, and you did it so calmly and wonderfully when we were in a panic. We also had a great contributor down in LA who did a lot of some of the legendary ladies' portraits and some of the other Shadowrun portraits.
I know you want to get your hands on the book. Let's see. I think we've taken all the questions. So our colleagues are going to sign books. There are books at the back. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in thanking Jenny and Tera and Natalie.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.